I mean, there's a lot, isn't there? There's a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of examples of things that you may have felt were matters so urgent, issues so egregious, that you would exercise, in many ways, the only right you have to tell the people in power what you think. And it's a right that becomes ever more precious according to how deaf the people in power are to your voices, or how much control the people, that's not quite correct, how much crossover, intersection there is between the people in power, the government, and the sources that we rely on for our information. And sometimes the disconnect between the public and the power, the disconnect between public and power can seem extraordinary. And I think we're in that position now. There's two articles that I would urge you to read, both of which you can read for free, although the second one would involve you signing up to the New York Times and availing yourself of the opportunity to read a couple of articles for nothing. It's an opinion piece by Thomas L. Friedman, and it appears under the headline, Israel is losing its greatest asset, acceptance. I'll just read you the opening lines. I've spent the past few days traveling from New Delhi to Dubai and Amman, and I have an urgent message to deliver to President Biden and the Israeli people. I am seeing the increasingly rapid erosion of Israel's standing among friendly nations, a level of acceptance and legitimacy that was painstakingly built up over decades. This columnist, who I don't think I've come across before, articulating something that I have tried to articulate to you myself. Those of us who desperately want Israel to retain the support and the standing that it currently enjoys among friendly nations, or certainly that it enjoyed quite rightly among friendly nations and friendly people when that terrorist atrocity commenced on October the 7th, are worried that the continuing actions of Benjamin Netanyahu's government are alienating precisely the people who can agitate and articulate in favor of the Israeli position. That would be the first article that I would direct you to today. The second would be a piece in The Guardian, which of course you can read for nothing, by the rather brilliant journalist Raphael Behr, who I think is Jewish. Certainly, if I've read it correctly, I mean, he is. And he makes the point that the conflation, if you like, the symmetry, the exhausting symmetry, the grim symmetry with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, in many ways lets everybody down. He doesn't use the word, but it speaks to the theory of footballification. It's essentially saying that we're allowing Islamophobia to become a Conservative Party problem and anti-Semitism to be a Labour Party problem, which not only makes a mockery of many of the facts, but also profoundly lets down the victims of both bigotries. The idea, he describes it as a grim, exhausting symmetry, and brilliantly articulates something which, again, I've tried to explain to you myself this week and in previous weeks, about how it is being used opportunistically by people who actually, by dint of the way they're built, they could easily go the other way if the wind changed. Certainly a lot of the people on the right of British politics claiming to be exercised by anti-Semitism would be very comfortably anti-Semitic if they felt that that was more use to their political ambitions or their media projections. And many people on the left who claim to be profoundly anti-racist somehow have an enormous blind spot when it comes to anti-Semitism. And it does none of us any favours, least of all victims of anti-Semitism and indeed Islamophobia. So I just want to put that backdrop in place before I tell you what the current Home Secretary, and you can be forgiven for not being able to keep up with who's in that job. So Suella Braverman's been sacked again, if you've been nodding off a bit or on holiday. Suella Braverman now has been sacked by the last two Conservative Prime Ministers, but she remains a very well-known author of legal textbooks. Oh, no, I beg your pardon. That was something that she claimed she'd done when it turned out all she'd done was a little bit of photocopying for the actual author. So James Cleverly, the king of nominative determinism, has told Palestinian protesters to stop protesting regularly. And I am going to ask you what you think of that, because my initial reaction to it is one of, it's a form of fear. If I talk about previous protests, I'm not necessarily suggesting that the cause of pro-Palestinian protesters is of equal value or equal salience to the other causes. But I'm imagining suffragists, of course, protesting. Suffragettes went rather further. And they were essentially victims of politicians trying to take their right of protest away. Freedom of assembly, as much as freedom of expression, are absolutely crucial to the public's ability to hold power to account. You have, I suppose, apartheid in South Africa as something which the powerful in this country supported and were comfortable with. Most obviously, I think, Margaret Thatcher and her ilk. And yet the importance of protesting against that, whether through marches or boycotts or otherwise, was, I think, in retrospect, pretty close to sacrosanct. There will be other things. Pick your favourite. That's why I opened the show in the way that I did. You've made your point now. No more protests about fox hunting, please. You've made your point now. No more protests against war, please. You've made your point now. No more protests against women not having the vote, please. You've made your point now. No more protests against segregation on public transport in America. No more protests against de facto colour bars in various employments in even this country. You can't drive a bus if you're black, but please stop protesting about it. No, you've made your point. So that's the principle that James Cleverly is taking aim at today. He says, and I quote, "I think the organisers should recognise that they've made their point. They've made it loudly, and they're not adding to it by repeating themselves." I'm not sure I could disagree with that more strongly. But I don't want to confine this conversation to people on the same side of it as me, because somewhere beyond the principle lie the practicalities. And the practicalities of it are increasing costs to the Metropolitan Police, currently under, we are told, their greatest period of sustained pressure since the London Olympics in 2012. We know that the scenes on Saturday on Tower Bridge were unacceptable. Vehicles and pedestrians unable to use that thoroughfare after demonstrators lit flares as they demanded a ceasefire in Gaza. Not to make light of it, but some dopes lit flares at Kidderminster Harriers game against Solihull Moors last night, and they're unlikely to have their collars felt any more than the people who did it on Tower Bridge. So again, don't get carried away with the characterisation of the protests. Generally, the behaviours in which we get caught up and irritated by would be relatively commonplace in other contexts. They really did throw a flare onto the pitch at Solihull last night, but it didn't stop Phil Brown's Red and White Army from securing a valuable and possibly season-changing 1-0 victory over our local rivals. I digress slightly. The central question, in a way, is about the significance of a Home Secretary telling you that you're not really allowed to protest anymore. You should stop protesting. I want your immediate response to that on 0345 6060 James Cleverly, it has been suggested already in a couple of texts, could he not just tell Israel that they've made their point too? With, I think now in excess of 30,000 people dead. Equally, could you not just tell Hamas that they've made their point too? They're no more likely to stop their murderous ambitions than Israel is to stop its continuing attack upon Palestinian people in Gaza. And if you prefer semantics to principles, you could say their continuing attack on Hamas in Gaza, which unfortunately involves the killing of tens of thousands of innocent civilians and rendering, I think, 17,000 children orphans, or at least unaccompanied in the current context. I don't know if you describe it as collateral damage, but certainly some people are prepared to accommodate that morally in order to pursue the greater goal, which sometimes is the eradication of Hamas, sometimes it's the release of the hostages, and sometimes it's neither, and sometimes it's both. But it is a greater goal. So 10:15 is the time. What would you say to James Cleverly? when he tells you, as someone who goes on these marches, you've made your point now, please stop. All right? That's what I want to hear. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Newspapers are queuing up to condemn protesters. Very hard to find anywhere in the media that properly reflects the public opinion described in opinion polls. And James Cleverly, as the killing continues, is somehow in a place where he thinks telling the people calling for the killing to stop have made their point. Surely the point is only made when it's stopped. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't marched. I'm tempted to go along. There's one a week on Saturday. I'm tempted to go along simply to see whether or not the pictures you have painted for me about what's actually going on at these marches is more accurate than the one being painted by people like Suella Braverman and 30p Lee Anderson. All right? So, how serious is it when a Home Secretary tells peaceful protesters to stop marching? And you can make the point, well, you know, they've been let down by the ones that aren't peaceful, but that would apply to pretty much any protest ever. And the second question is, what would you personally say to James Cleverly when he tells you, as a pro-Palestinian protester, that you've made your point now and it's time to stay at home? Have a think about that. You don't even have to have been on the marches, of course. You could just be sympathetic to the general cause of wanting to see an end to the killing in Gaza and the release of the hostages, of course. 0345 6060 973. The actual Home Secretary is telling peaceful protesters to stop because they have made their point. I want your thoughts on that. And of course, you come at it from agreeing with him as well. I'd really welcome that, actually. You need to be a little bit sensible. Don't ring in to complain about the fact that we're talking about something different from the thing that you wish we were talking about. That rarely goes well. But do give me a call and tell me why you think James Cleverly is right. In fact, I know I'm a little late for the break, but I'll just take a moment to stress that point still further. Because there is a clash between principle and practicality. You know, you cannot have London subject to a mass protest every single day. London cannot be brought to a standstill every single day. You know, I think the last time things were really, really brought to an absolute standstill were probably the Queen's funeral. I mean, imagine if something of that scale was unfolded. We would literally never get anything done. And therefore, you may have a strong case, logistically, practically, whatever it may be, for saying, actually, do you know what? James Cleverly is right. We've marched a dozen times. Everybody knows we're there. Everybody knows what we want. Nothing's really changed. Therefore, I'm going to accept James Cleverly's advice and stop protesting because, in his own words, we're not really saying anything new. Please stop killing people. Yes, you said that last week. You're not really saying anything new. I think you can stop now. You can stop calling for the killings to end because you're not really saying anything new. Go on, have a crack. 0345 6060 973.